Updated December 1, 2017 160,651 POC, which stands for Person of Color, is a term I have heard used more and more in Australia over the past few years, especially online. While it is a familiar term, it isn't one that originated in Australia. And so I hadn't really paused to reflect on what I thought about it in depth, until recently. This was the Twitter exchange between me and my RN colleague Beverly Wang that made me stop to contemplate it. While others dived in with answers, I sat back and watched the thread grow, unsure of how to pack the complexity of my own views into a couple of tweets. The answers to her question were, for the most part, engaging, challenging, and nuanced, highlighting the difficulties in coming up with a collective name for disparate groups, who all share one thing in common: not identifying as white. As an Aboriginal person who has been actively involved in issues of language and terminology, much of the conversation seemed oddly familiar. Aboriginal, Aborigines, Indigenous, First Nations, First Peoples, First Nations peoples, First Australians. With so many existing terminologies that attempt to define hundreds of different groups with different languages and cultures, I wasn't exactly in the market for a new umbrella term, like POC. But I believe it is important to understand where these terms come from, when making decisions about which ones you choose to identify with. Meaning behind one capital letter among Indigenous people, there is no consensus around one clearly preferred term, and there probably never will be. But when you have our history, and make up just 3% of the population, you understand the need to speak with a collective voice. Because terminology is important. The words we use to describe ourselves, and the words others use to describe us, have power. Perhaps more than anyone else, Aboriginal people understand how just one letter, or the choice of lower or uppercase, can make the difference over whether you are seen as an equal human. I am Aboriginal, but not an Aboriginal or Aborigine. I am Indigenous, but not Indigenous. I am First Nations, but not a First Australian. If anything, Indigenous people are the last Australians, as we were the last to be granted citizenship rights. I am Gamalawa. That's just me though. Every other Indigenous person has their own views and preferences for terminology that they use. Apart from Gamalawa, which is a traditional term, all these other terms were introduced. When white people were first describing us, they called us Aboriginal. In their eyes, we did not have a name that derived from our place, like other groups of people around the world. For example, an Australian person is from Australia, but an Aboriginal person is not from Aboriginalia. Rather than a nationality, we were given a classification. We were Aboriginal, or Native, the same terms used to describe fauna and flora. Over time we rejected the term Native but claimed the terms Aborigines and Aboriginal for ourselves, demanding that they be spelled with capital letters. This is a simple, but profound trick of the English language that elevates the terms from nouns and adjectives into the realm of proper nouns and proper adjectives. This gave us status, and demanded that we be recognized as equals, not merely as subjects to be labeled and put on the shelf, often, quite literally. If this is hard to understand, imagine if Australia was the only country in international circles that did not get a capital letter. An Australian ambivalence. More recently, the term Aborigines has been abandoned by many Aboriginal people as feeling outdated and inappropriate. And in the 1990s, Indigenous entered the Australian lexicon in a big way, following the first UN Year of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and a recognition by Aboriginal academics that identifying with a global Indigenous identity would help build solidarity around common concerns. It also gave a central term that included Torres Strait Islanders as well, because while Torres Strait Islanders are Indigenous, they are not Aboriginal. Yet despite the fact that the push to be identified as Indigenous came from within Aboriginal academia, I've encountered plenty of Aboriginal people who resist it, because they assume it is a government-introduced term. And so I found it fascinating to see a similar ambivalence for the term POC, as the responses rolled in on Twitter. The truth is that, like Indigenous, people of color has roots in language fostered by the United Nations. It's the offspring of women of color, which was coined at the 1977 National Women's Conference in Houston, organized in response to the 1975 UN International Women's Year. Native American, Latino, Asian and Pacific Islander women asked to join the Black Women's Agenda, which was to be presented at the conference. Within those negotiations, the term women of color was created, and it was created as a statement of solidarity, that people who are oppressed because of their race or ethnic background will work together. Loretta Ross, a veteran of the U.S. women's movement and lecturer at Hampshire College in the United States, says, "You're a born African American, you're a born Asian Pacific Islander, or Filipino. But it isn't a biological designation so much as a political designation." So, like the adoption of the term indigenous in Australia, person of color is a political term, created in response to a specific American context. Maybe that's why, even though I know by default that my indigeneity means that I fall into the category of person of color, that label sits uncomfortably on me, as it does with many other Aboriginal people. The place of First Nations people within that broader term POC is one that I question, and it's one that I am not entirely comfortable with. Eugenia Flynn, a Melbourne-based writer, art worker and community organizer who identifies as Aboriginal, Chinese and Muslim, says, "I think that when we lump everybody together as people of color, that doesn't do justice to the racialization and the racism that is very unique in Australia to Indigenous peoples, to First Nations peoples. Homogenization or unity? For me it's a question of unity within those distinct identities. If we drew a Venn diagram with terms like Indigenous, POC, ethnic, black, racism, anti-blackness, would POC encircle all these other areas, with some areas of overlap, or would some be sitting outside? Does identifying as a person of color in Australia homogenize the unique experiences of Aboriginal people, or is it a tool to develop strength and unity, and highlight the shared challenges of eliminating racial discrimination? Is it a term intended to embrace Indigenous identities in a way that terms like multicultural or ethnic have failed to do in the past? When people generally talk about multiculturalism, what they're really talking about is migrants. They're not talking about First Nations people. I think that's pretty rare, Ms. Flynn says. So while we grapple for an appropriate team name, I wonder if it is even possible to land on a one-size-fits-all term we can all agree on, when at the core of it, our common trait is that throughout history, we have been designated as other by white colonists, explorers, traders, settlers and conquerors. My own experience suggests that we will never find consensus on such a term, but also, that it doesn't really matter if we do or not. People are free to identify however they choose, and if terms like POC resonate with some people, but not others, then this should not provide any cause for concern. What is important though is that people explore ways to build solidarity around collective experiences, shared goals, and common challenges, that we embrace differences and educate ourselves and each other about the history of those who have always been here, and those who have come here as part of the ongoing colonial project that is Australia. How we navigate these differences and create opportunities for sharing can enhance our individual, national, and global identities. And I do not feel as though I need a shared name to work in solidarity with others to achieve this. Topics: immigration, Indigenous, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander, Indigenous other peoples, multiculturalism, race relations, colonialism. Australia first posted December 1, 2017, 102,912.